Hi, I'm Alister Benn, and this is Vision and Light. This week, I'm speaking to a true legend of the landscape photography genre, Mr. Charlie Cramer. Now, it was such an honor for me to speak with Charlie, and his legacy goes back into the 70s when he first started shooting, and he was in Yosemite and he was meeting Ansel Adams and being on workshops with Ansel and ultimately having his work shown in the Ansel Adams Gallery in Yosemite. So over 40 years, and like Bill Neal, he's someone who has such an incredibly organic relationship with his subjects. And during this conversation, we really touch on how his style developed, how his images developed, and how his creativity has developed. So I hope you enjoy this, the 22nd episode of Vision and Light with myself, Alister Benn, and this week's guest, Charles Cramer.
So an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Charlie Cramer.
Well, thank you.
It's a pleasure to finally get to speak with you. I've been a massive fan of your work for so many years. Now, for anyone who watches Vision and Light, one of the key things about it is the individual perspectives that different artists have. Now, obviously, for someone that's had quite so many years behind the lens as you have, I'm curious to think, how do you think your work has evolved throughout that period of time? How have you managed to stay engaged with the art form for so many years?
Okay, well, in one sense, it hasn't evolved. I know many artists like Huntington Witherell who cannot do the same thing for 7 years. They have to completely switch. But I've been very happy just doing the same old thing. So in one sense, it hasn't evolved. I mean, I've gotten, a little more abstract, perhaps.
Okay.
But, and back when I was doing 4x5, you had to think very carefully about what you were photographing. And I'm a big fan of using the cutout cards, the little cards that you look through to see what you're doing. And I'd be hopeless without those because, so I went to the, my first workshop really was the Ansel Adams Gallery, actually Ansel Adams Workshops. And it was in 1977. And he passed out those viewing cards. And took me a year to realize, maybe I should try those out. And after that, I've been sold. And so there's not many people use them. I know John Sexton has to have one. Right. I like the jumbo size, and he likes the mini, which makes a lot of sense because he could stick it in his pocket, and they're made out of a plastic material. So, with 4x5, you don't get the film and scanning is very expensive.
Yes.
And so you tend to be very careful. And I think that's why the viewing cards are helpful. And when I was photographing, that helped me.
Now, when are you still shooting analog mostly, or do you shoot digital these days?
Okay. Well, actually, I started printing digitally in what, 97?
97,
which was the first time that a good way to reproduce digital prints came out. It was the light jet, and also Fuji created this crystal archive paper. And so suddenly, with the combination of the two, we could print very easily. We had to learn Photoshop and get a file scanned. And I was very fortunate that I started teaching actually for the Ansel Adams Gallery back in 96 or maybe even earlier. But one of the students in my class was somebody named Bill Atkinson, who, you may not know, and I didn't know who he was, but he was one of the main designers of the Macintosh.
Oh, right.
And he was also passionately involved in photography. I mean, although he hadn't been doing it much, but when he retired in, I think, 96 or so, he had the money to buy all the best toys. So he had his own drum scanner.
Right.
And at that time, the best printer for home use like that was an iris printer, which completely, it's ridiculous nowadays when we look at it. And it was in 96, I think, that suddenly we could make prints that were decent, because we had long realized that the control you get with digital is unparalleled. And since 1980, I had actually been a masochist and printing with dye transfer.
Yes, I was
just
aware
gave
of
me a
that.
little more control, but God, was that a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I was delighted when the digital option came out, and then so I've been doing that for quite a while, and since the last century, and then in 2006, when I had friends who had switched to digital, that I finally completely sold out.
Okay.
And I got I figured, I could get a phase one. They were the only decent back then, and they cost a fortune.
Yep.
And they still do. But I figured, 3 years of scanning or 4x5 film.
Right.
And I thought my batting average could go way up. That was my thought.
And
so, I could take many more pictures, just experiment. I thought that this is the way to go. But it took a couple of years, but I realized my batting average did not go up for some reason. And it's still just as hard to get a picture that means something.
No, that's a very, very curious point. And this is why I love about the serendipity of a conversation, is that we can just pounce on something that you say. So the thing that springs to my mind there is that more of a function of the number, a finite number of true engaging opportunities that we're capable of kind of registering? Is that kind of, is the batting average based on really how many things are out there in nature that are just aligned in the way that we prefer them to be?
I'm not completely sure. When I was doing 4x5, and I usually go out for like 2.5 weeks, and the most 4x5s I took on such a trip was maybe a little over 300. And now with digital, you could take that many easily in one day.
Sure.
And I think one of the things that I had to get over was that, to me, somehow it felt that the digital files were not as inherently worth much as a 4x5. And so editing the photos, I think, was the next, challenge. And I remember, Ansel Adams said 12 photographs that mean something in a year was good production.
Right.
And I remember speaking to Don Worth, a wonderful photographer and a big influence on me also. He was one of Ansel's early assistants back in the late 50s. And he said, because I talked to him at depth on these subjects, and he said, I would like to completely forget even taking the photos, and then I can come back and accurately judge them. John Sexton still says that the photographer is the only person who can't be objective about his work.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's a curious thing, and it's something I think an awful lot about. I think where digital really comes into its own is when photographing chaos, like flowing water and
absolutely, yes.
It's a big investment to shoot 4x5 of flowing water, and you might take a couple, and if it's aesthetically the way you want it to be, then great. But obviously with digital, we've got so many more cracks of the whip.
And when I was doing film, even around 2002, 3 or so, I realized that I loved to take water pictures. And one advantage was that the tilt on the 4x5 lets you, because to capture some of these water details, you need a fast exposure. And the tilt on the 4x5 helped, solve that problem.
With the smaller aperture.
But I realized that on trips, I started bringing my 4x5 1 or 220 film reduction back. And I remember on a particular trip that this incredible scene, well, I didn't realize what was happening until a little later. So I love to take pictures in shade. In fact, that's my main light source. But so I found this waterfall in shade. And as I was taking it, the sun was rising behind it. And so as it got a little higher, water would spurt out from the waterfall and suddenly be highlighted by the sun.
Right.
And I thought, wow. And this, over the course of an hour or two, this just got better and better. And so I had to guess it, like the little spurt of water was so quick that I couldn't really meter it. So I had to guess. And I figured I'd probably want a slightly long exposure to get a blur to it. And so that one morning, something that's, predicting digital, I took 10 rolls of 220. So that's like 220 photos.
Oh, wow.
But, things like that convinced me that I really should switch.
Yeah, I've just picked up a Hasselblad 501 recently, just to get back into shooting 6x6. It's just such a beautiful medium. And I think I was in Iceland about a month ago, and I think I shot 320 digital frames and about 35 film frames, and that was about it in 10 days.
So in 10 days you only took 350 digital pictures? Well, I admire you.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's yeah, and I don't know why that is these days. I shoot a lot less than I used to, for sure. But I've been looking at a lot of your work recently, in sort of preparation of speaking with you, and something that I find quite standoutish for me is that your work seems to have a timelessness about it, in that it feels as if it's been there forever, almost in a strangely sort of profound way. But equally, it feels very contemporary. So there's this sort of, it seems to span the history of landscape photography in a way. Is that there's a I think the fact that most of it's 4x5 obviously makes it look classic in that way. But obviously there's become this much more contemporary trend of photographing smaller, intimate scenes rather than the big vista, the big landscape type of thing. So is there something conscious about you, the way that you approach the landscape? Do you look, or do you just recognize?
Well, one of the first things when I started doing dye transfer, I realized that, there's so many generations to make a dye transfer print. So the actual print is like the third or fourth generation. So it's a dust magnet. And
yes.
I think like Elliot Porter, you'll see this in his work too, there's not many skies because it's just such an absolute pain. So and so you'll notice I hardly ever, well, I can do sky now, and yes. I did it with film too, but it's, I've trained myself to mainly see things, below the horizon.
Right.
And when I see a sky, and especially if there's no clouds or things like that, I am forced to crop it off.
So, in terms of, I mean, when did you first start shooting? What I mean, you said 77 was when you went in your first Ansel workshop,
right? So, actually, I was just about, all through college and graduate school, I studied piano.
Yes.
And it was what, 74 or 5, I forget, when just before leaving for the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York for the first time, a friend took me to Yosemite. And, I live about 4 hours from Yosemite, and I'd never been there.
Wow.
And so it was a effing revelation. And so once I got to Rochester, I wanted to know more about Yosemite and Ansel Adams. So since Kodak is also in Rochester, they have a great public library collection of photography books. And it was there that I read about Ansel Adams. And I heard that he was a pianist initially, and then, switched to photography. And so I was smitten with photography. And so, I guess I was still kind of, and to really teach piano, you need a doctorate. And, but I didn't want to go back to Eastman. So I did some public school things, and I actually learned a lot about teaching, things like that. So I've always, in a sense, wanted to be a teacher. And it's just I'm not doing the subject that I studied. So from 74, 5 to 77, that's not very long. But, I could devote, I took, after 2 years at Eastman, I took the next year off and just did photography.
Right.
So, I wasn't the greatest student at the Ansel Adams workshop. But I somehow I've maintained that interest and passion, and here I still am.
Yeah, so I mean, my maths is appalling, but mid-70s to now is what, 45 years or thereabouts. Something like. I thought when I was speaking to Bill the other week, and that 40 years was getting there, but you've picked him because
actually, I think Bill and I were about the same age.
Right.
And he also, started at the Ansel Adams Gallery. And, but he was more actually in line with being a pianist, because what does a pianist do? We play these scores of music, many written hundreds or more years ago, because those are the greatest works. And so there was this weird thing that happened, because I started taking pictures, and guess what? They were kind of like Ansel Adams. And I was mainly interested in the printing.
Right.
And so I remember somebody arranged a local gallery curator to see my work. And, I really wasn't ready. But anyway, I brought these in, and she looked like at 3 or 4 or 5. And then she looked up at me and said, "But these have been done before."
Right.
And it was like, what? Because in music, of course, I mean, at least in piano, we play the pieces everybody plays. So
right.
I later learned that a friend at Eastman who was studying composition had a terrible time because he was forced, literally, well, not literally, but he'd be laughed out of class if he tried to write traditional music.
Right.
And at this Ansel Adams workshop, one of the sessions was on developing your art strategy, or in other words, the gimmick. Because in the visual arts, there's this huge temptation, or it's the tyranny of the new. And I've had friends who went off to study college and study photography in college, and they came back doing completely different things. So,
right.
But somehow I resisted that pressure, and like I said, I pretty much do the same thing.
Well, you know, you obviously love what you do then, you know, because I mean, like I said, I've been spending a lot of time with your work, and it's massively diverse. You know, it's really, really hugely diverse. You know, for saying thematically and from a subject point of view, there's quite a lot of similarity. It's a very, very diverse body of work, and it all feels it feels quite a joyful body of work. You know, it's as if there's a sort of celebratory nature to it. Would you identify with that? I mean, do you think yourself as more of an emotional person or an analytical person? You know, how you know, I'm very curious about, you know, because you have a relationship with a piece of music, which is there's a technical aspect to it.
Oh, yeah.
There's the notes are of a certain duration and of a certain pitch and you know, and so forth, and your emotional input into that is your personality to a certain extent. So I'm interested between these parallels and how much of your personality is coming out in your work versus it being a more sort of technical visual design exercise.
Right. Well, I am actually a slow learner, and in my piano playing, I was fortunate to have a tremendous technique. In other words, the notes were not that hard for me, but what was hard for me was getting the emotion through. And it was actually this wonderful teacher that I had in the school I went to here at San Jose State University. um, she came from Eastman, and that's why me and several other students ended up going to Eastman. But
Right.
that was kind of her specialty, and supposedly she's Japanese, and supposedly she still used to fly back and forth and teach Japanese students because her specialty was, you know, getting the emotion out, and so she was just what I needed.
Right.
And she taught me so much. In fact, I still see her. Uh, so she's going like, you know, great. And she lives pretty close. So not only did she teach me about music, but since I spent an extra year at San Jose State, I got this honors thing. And so I had to write a little piece, piece of, you know, like a dissertation or something, a mini dissertation. And so did this friend. We ended up both going to Eastman, but we went in and showed her the work and, you know, the words, and she was relentless. And my friend remarked, which is true, she says, she's just as critical about words as she is to music. So she helped me refine my writing craft. And, you know, and then since I got into photography, some of what I've learned with her, you know, has carried over into my photography. But initially, I was just doing kind of rote work. But over time, I did learn and I got better. So it was a slow journey for me. So I always like to tell people, you know, don't give up. And one of the people that I really love is actually a painter that somebody introduced me to maybe 15, 20 years ago. His name is Ran Ortner.
Okay.
And he does big canvases of ocean waves.
Right.
So his work, you know, in a sense, is kind of traditional. But what he says, and I think I remember, he says, art is not a novelty contest, nor or I guess I don't remember, you know, not a contest of innovation. It is an honesty contest.
Okay.
And he says, if you can be true to yourself and what you see, down to what you really believe, eventually, and this is what I believe, I think this is what happened to me. Eventually you're still doing the same thing, but you've been doing it so long, you get better at it. And suddenly, it's like suddenly you have a style, even though, it's what you've been doing all along.
Well, yeah, and I think that kind of comes out in your work, that, this is where a lot of this sort of rhythmic nature of some of your work is. Now, the thing I'm kind of still interested in is that there's craft and then there's expression, there's craft and there's emotion.
Okay.
What were the types of things that allowed you to develop your emotional articulation, both in the piano and in your photography?
Okay. Well, I had another wonderful friend who turns out I met him at the 77 workshop, and he lived in Australia, but he actually was already a friend of Ansel's, and had whenever Ron's family came to visit, they would visit Ansel's. And so when suddenly we became friends, and the gods were kind, because there's like 60 people at the workshops by the time I got into them, and they divide you into groups of 10. So thank God he was in my group, and he wanted to start a scholarship to bring photographers to Australia. And somehow I got selected, and one other person. So he basically sponsored a trip to Australia.
Right.
And then when he came to the States, he would always go down to Carmel and drop over Ansel's house. And so when that happened, he invited me. So I got to know Ansel a little. And so where was I going with this?
We're heading down this avenue of how your expressive nature was lit on fire.
Thank you. So I remember a dinner we had with Ansel, and I got my friend arranged it so I was sitting straight across from him. And this is when we went out to a restaurant. Normally he had his own chef, actually, and so they have a lovely meal at his place, which I did also. But at this restaurant, I started asking Ansel, about his piano study, and he sounded very methodical and kind of Germanic. In other words, he said, well, first hour would be, scales, technical things, and then Bach, and then Brahms. And so he had it all very methodically, all laid out. And as a pianist, that's kind of what you learn. And so when I started in photography, and I was doing black and white at the time, I was a big believer, in the zone system. Mm-hmm. And I would do tests and all kinds of things like that. And then Ron invited us back on another trip to Australia. And he also invited this photographer I mentioned, Don Worth. And Don, as it turns out, believe it or not, had a almost identical background to mine. He started as a pianist and went to Juilliard. And so he came on one of these, actually 2 trips to Australia. And it was, so we could, it was like having a month-long lesson with Don Worth. And he, he was going to develop some film that he brought with him. Because it was all film at the time.
Yeah.
And I said, are you going to do a test for zone 8 so you know how long to develop it? And he said, no, I'll just develop the first roll and we'll see how it looks, and then I'll adjust accordingly. So that was kind of informative, and broke with, the very, strict training that Ansel included. Because I think he still, he had, other people by this time, his assistants, developed the film, and I'm sure they had to develop just right. And I know I've been fortunate to teach workshops with John Sexton for the last 10 years or so, and have learned his, and he still basically does a lot of testing. And
Right.
even though it's easier now than when Ansel started, because when Ansel started, the film was quite different. And not only, nowadays the important thing to do is get lots of shadow detail.
Right.
But back then, it was a narrower range. And so if you overexposed too much, you would hit the shoulder of the film, and then you would have no highlight detail.
Yeah.
So it was much harder, 40, 50 years ago to get the film right on the money. And
yeah.
so, or you'd have grain. And so John still follows that very carefully.
No, I'm still curious about the creative side of this, because I think there's so much craft. I mean, there's so much craft and technique. I'm a guitar player. Guitar is my instrument and has been for 30 odd years. So there's a lot of technique in that. Nuances and things like that. And a camera is just a tool that sucks light out of the air. That's pretty much all it does. So what you point it at and then how you express yourself through your work is a very internal thing. Now, I'm still curious as to the development of that, because you said that the technical side of things in the piano was natural to you, or more natural to you, but it was still this development of the expressive and the creative and the emotional. So I'm still kind of curious as to the types of ways that you were able to nurture your creative side and the emotional side.
Well, I did take, besides Ansel Adams, I took a couple workshops back then, in the early 80s, including, I think, one with John Sexton and Bruce Barnbaum and Ray McSavany. And the main thing they did was print critiques.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I got that, I actually have not taken any more workshops. But it's just did I hit a wrong button here? I think so.
No, I can see. Everything's fine.
It was just feedback. I get the 4x5 back, and one of the early mistakes I think I made was relying on my brain. And, because you could, like camera clubs, you could follow all the rules, but it would still be a kind of a dead picture. And I realized that, maybe by the early 80s, that I can't go, by the rules. I have to, see if my blood pressure goes up, if I react to a scene. And so I'll frame a scene with the cutout card and then see if I get a reaction. If I don't, even though technically it might be a good picture, I've learned just to move on and do something different.
So it's basically in your gut.
Yeah, it kind of came to life, or it was just a long learning experience. Now, interesting. If you've been to my website recently, you might realize that I completely redid it with the help of a friend, maybe 6 months ago. And the pictures on there are still primarily the older 4x5s.
Right.
And just, maybe a third of the new digital pictures. And in fact, I have a portfolio category there where you can search for which ones are digital.
All right.
And so I just feel I was very fortunate in some of those 4x5 exposures. And it just, I've learned there's 3 tests a good picture has to pass. So number 1, when you take the picture, you have to have some emotional response. And then when you get the film back and look at it, sometimes, it didn't do a thing for you. So, okay, it didn't get through, in other words. And, but once in a while, the picture would get through. And I go, oh, yes. And then if you made a print, then the question is, does it still get through? And, it doesn't happen very often. I've been doing a bunch of printing lately, and, I select them on the screen, you know, and I'm pretty critical about what I'm going to select, but it's really only when I make proof prints that I can tell, because sometimes they come to life as a print and sometimes they don't. So, and then I put them on the wall. I have in my studio, which is not here, but I have very fortunate to have room, and I have like a 19-foot rail, and so I can put pictures in little white frames and lay them on these rails.
Right.
And so I can quickly, you know, I can live with them a little.
Okay.
And this is something I think John Sexton teaches too, that because he has some big rails in his house, and sometimes he says, okay, this picture isn't working, so he'll just leave one up. And in the course of daily activities and things like that, he says sometimes it'll just come to him and he realizes this is what he has to do.
Okay.
And with my railing, I mean, I can produce them much quicker than John can, but sometimes I get to enjoy the pictures more, you know, and like them even more. Sometimes they get on my nerves. And so that's the test nowadays. Does the picture get on your nerves?
So do you, I mean, one of the things I love speaking to yourself, and Bill was exactly the same. He was very, very similar in his approach, is that there's a relationship with your work. It sounds very much like you have a relationship with your work that's very genuine and almost has a permanence to it, in that by the time something is chosen as a representation of your creativity or your art form, it's a very considered opinion. Whereas I think contemporary photography, especially since most of it's digital now, there's an immediacy to it where, you know, you're in the field, you get a preview there and then of what you're doing, you're instantly judging, you're instantly evaluating, and then before you know it, you're home, it's processed, it's on Instagram or Flickr or some other website, and it's only a matter of minutes since you were in the field kind of building the initial relationship with the thing. So do you think that immediacy of delivery of the moment somehow makes them less considered and maybe a little bit more frivolous, or do you see that as a potential advantage?
You know, well, there is a case to be made for spontaneity, and but that's not me. And you know, people are surprised how, you know, when are you going to put up some new pictures? And yeah, I'm very careful about selecting them. And my feeling is, you know, if you put up a picture that, you know, isn't that exciting, it can detract from all the rest. And it's just like the lowest common denominator. And so I try to keep them up. And the website I actually initially built myself was in 2007. And so there was a lot of pictures on there that I've actually did not choose to include in the redo here.
Right.
You know, and so I think I was more thoughtful about them too. So.
Well, it's impressive, you know, because obviously I'm 50 something, 54 or whatever. And I've been in the photography scene for about 20 years. So since my early 30s. And digital came in very soon after I was kind of in the marketplace. And I feel like there's been a devaluation of photography within society because it's just so abundant. You know, you like you said, Ansel used to talk about 12 meaningful photographs a year, whereas people expect that every 15 minutes when they're out in the field now. It's almost as if it become very demanding.
Yeah. I was going to say several things here.
Good.
Yeah. So people are, like I said, I think shocked at how slowly I operate, and it takes me a while. And I've learned to also trust the guts of friends.
Hmm.
And so often, uh, uh, you know, when people drop over, I'll lay out prints and I'll say, which is your, I won't ask which is the best, but, which is your favorite?
Hmm.
And sometimes they'll choose one and I'll say, really? Because obviously I liked it because I printed it, but I'm surprised that they're responding to those. And many times that has opened my eyes.
Right.
And we have a little, well, we used to, before the pandemic, a little critique group. We would get together and show each other pictures. And I found that very worthwhile. And I guess you could do it nowadays, send JPEGs or, which ones do you like and things like that.
Mm.
But yeah, I'm getting less of that now. And the so I just realized that back when our president was George W. Bush, uh, that near the end of his term, the economy was really in free fall, and in fact, things were going great for me. I mean, I had lots of print sales,
Mm.
and so this is the level of print sales. After 2008, it kind of went straight down, and like art consultants would tell me, well, we can't sell art now because the companies said it'd be irresponsible, investing in art, when they don't know if they're going to exist.
Mm.
And so that, I think, the rise of digital, which was already happening by then, has made it a much different field for photography.
Oh,
And
totally.
of course, now we're dealing with he who will not be named, and the poor U.S. Is, we're still in kind of a lockdown thing. I was supposed to go to the Photo Speed conference, which
Mm.
they've delayed until April, and so
Yeah.
supposedly I'm still going to be a speaker there, but I have my doubts. So
Yeah. Yeah.
'cause
It's
right now I can't even fly to the to
right.
Europe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You're not welcome over here. But this is the point, is that, I mean, well, we're in the same boat. Our entire year's worth of workshops has been cancelled. And we're learning to live with a new business model, which is online and online conferencing and one-to-ones online and teaching online and, that type of thing. But what we've suddenly got is this gift of time
Mm.
where we're looking at the rest of the year and we can go out and we can do our own projects and things like that. What I'd like to ask you is, because I think photography is a very broad thing, it can mean many different things to many different people. And I personally feel that there's an awful lot of focus on external validation, what other people think of our work. What would you say is your kind of grounding element with your photography? What's your kind of ground zero of what photography means to your life?
Well, it's I talk about when people are used to, I guess, go into a gallery and like the Ansel Adams gallery in Yosemite uh, was one of my best galleries, and people would go in there and you'd have prints on the wall, and suddenly they'd walk out after buying one. And what would prompt people to suddenly, without planning on it, drop all that money?
Right.
Well, they had more money back then, but I think it was the emotional impact.
Mm-hmm.
And it just kind of, sometimes a picture just hits people, and
Mm-hmm.
they do one of those, and I think that's the key. And so I try to maintain that as much as I can. I mean, And of course, right now it's just me doing that.
So do you think that that's the thing that sustains you in photography is when you're out in the landscape and you have those little wow moments of, you know, that touches your heart somehow, and it just lights a little fire?
Yeah, and I think I've learned that you have to empty your mind. You don't, if you go out, with a preconceived notion of a photograph, that's just going to blind you to other possibilities. So I try to go out not thinking what I'm going to take, and then just wander around, and suddenly, I'll react to it. And, but what I react to again is normally shade light, which is just so much easier to handle. There's no big contrast.
You didn't shoot Velvia by any chance, did you?
Well, once in a while
Right.
on the Southwest, when it was in shade,
right,
it would work then. But
what was your primary film in Yosemite? What did you tend to shoot in Yosemite?
Well, in Yosemite, contrast city, and so I would usually bring Provia or even color negative film.
Right.
So a number of on my website still, I have a picture of the backcountry. And of this lake, and it's just a stunning horizon line. So I had to include it, of course, as minimal as possible, but to have that all work. And this was like very late in the day, so it would fit. I took color negatives. Scanning them though is a nightmare. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't.
Right.
So it's a crapshoot, because the color management. The color negatives has such a wide contrast range that the color management doesn't really work.
Yeah.
So, but I would still take pictures that way. But again, it's not having anything particular in mind, just wandering around and let yourself be stimulated. And a bunch of friends and I would do these, and it's been 20 years now. Obviously, none this year, but we used to go up into some part of the Sierra, and we used to be sponsored by the Yosemite Association. We used to be, and but it was a very strange schedule, because we would all be up by the crack of dawn or before, because that's when the light's really good. And then after a little bit of backlighting, the sun does come up, but then we could do backlit photos, and those are very exciting too. But then, by 10 a.m., 11 a.m., it's just flat.
Right.
So then, very important. And because we had funding, we could bring gear in on mules. So we bring chairs in. Very important, so you could sit, have a nice comfy sit, and while away the middle of the day. And then only, a couple hours before sunset, then would we go out again. But I think that's the best light, actually.
Right. One final question. You've been very generous with your time so far. If you could only choose one, your piano or your camera, which one would it be?
Well, actually, as it turns out, I think I chose wisely, because I have friends I still see from when I went to school in San Jose State and things like that, who are wonderful musicians. But the way music works, it's you don't really have anything to sell except your time. And whereas with photography, we could sell prints. And so actually it worked out much to my advantage going into photography. I mean, that's not why I went in. And, I still do most galleries. I mean, color landscape, forget it. That's been done before. So they want something new and wild. But I've just hung in there.
Well, I just find it such an honor to speak with you, because it's it was similar when I was speaking with Bill.
Go on.
Well, there's this timeline of you know, this connection with Ansel and the sort of the birth of landscape photography. And I think the fact that you're still involved, you know, if we don't have to stop, then I'll ask you another question, which is, it seems to me that things come in waves. You know, that we get trends come along and different styles come along, and there's people like Galen Rowell had a massive influence in the 70s and 80s on landscape photography with like ND filters and more high dynamic range scenes and the sort of adventure side of things. And it was almost like a celebration of majesty was the sort of impact that Galen had. And you know, people like Mark Adamus, who I'm sure you're aware of, has kind of extended Galen's ethos into the 21st century. And where you're at with your work, and Bill is very, very similar. I have a couple of his books in the house, is that there's a celebration of intimacy. You know, a real sense of intimacy and recognizing that beauty isn't just in the big scale, it's in the details. It's a very joyful celebration of the small. And do you think that social media is kind of driving people into the more anonymous landscapes now because it's just to recapture the personal element of photography?
Well, you know, it's become kind of like trophy hunting, where okay, we've got to get one of the firefall at Yosemite. And, you know, it's gotten huge crowds would show up. And other things, you know, like the moonbow in the spring. So I think a lot of us have learned and not to put on your photo where you've taken the photo.
Yes.
Otherwise, yeah, so I think that's very a destructive thing, and nowadays, well, when I started, you know, like I said, I started in dye transfer because it was very hard to make a good color print. I mean, we had Cibachrome basically, and but I loved the Southwest, and so it had a red problem that. Maybe it was a temporary thing, but I thought, okay, well, that's not going to work. So then I made the mistake of taking up dye transfer. But, you know, it filled the bill. And nowadays, it's almost too easy to make a good print. I mean, so that's my complaint about photography. It's become too easy.
So how do we counter that? I mean, how can we it's not compensate for the ease of it. You know, something has to make it more poignant. Something has to make it more internal and profound. You know, so do you think it's the sense of introspection becomes the more important aspect to it? Is it's what the images are telling us perhaps about ourselves, or
well, you have to know what your audience is. And Bill Atkinson, who I've referenced, you know, an incredible wealth of knowledge. And he and I actually used to teach together. And he put up his website just a little before my earliest one, which was, 97, or actually maybe even before that. But he had a feature on his website. He had like also 700 photos. And the feature was people could select their favorites. And, but he said after a while, he disabled that feature because he said if any picture had a snow-covered peak, it would become a favorite. And so I think the problem is, you know, who's your audience? And so to attract the general public, you know, then you do the simple things that as I described, you know, you look at them initially and you go, wow. And I had a series of books that I got actually when I started photography, and one, both color photography books, and I won't mention, well, and over time, this one book, I looked at it, that I initially went, wow. I got tired of it over time because I don't think it had lasting power. And the one book that I really liked and I still love is by a photographer nobody knows called Richard Kaufman. And that's Kaffman.
Okay.
And it was one of the first Sierra Club books, of large format books. You can still find it. It's called Gentle Wilderness, and it's pictures of him backpacking in the Sierra. And it took a while, but I realized I love those pictures because they have the lasting power. And in speaking to Joseph Holmes, a good friend and was also a spectacular photographer, I started mentioning this, and he goes, "That's the book that made me want to become a photographer."
Right.
So, who can describe what lasting power is? I couldn't, but I realized that, and it's kind of like in music, there's all, who has survived like Mozart and all these big names, but there's all kinds of other composers. But, people, initially they might have done great, but people, lost interest in them maybe because it didn't have as much lasting power. And so I think that's an important element.
But it's, the other thing also is that, there's a very small percentage of us who make all of our income from landscape photography. I mean, there's not, as a percentage of all photographers, it's a very small percentage.
Yes. And to that, I can say, thank God. Because if you have to make a living, then, then you'll do what sells. But I had since I was a musician, I continue, who hires keyboard artists? A lot of churches do. So for many years, I played in various churches. Right. And so there was a steady income, and it allowed me to be somewhat free of, having to make the living completely from photography. And I think, that really helped.
Because I think that's the big juxtaposition is I mean, this is my job. I mean, this is what I do for a living, and all our income comes from photography and mostly teaching now.
Yes.
But it's having that strong sense of, no, these are the images that I want to make, rather than these are the images that are going to be popular. And and that's why I'm trying to create a niche of this type of photography that you do.
The picture you're in front of is very lovely.
Oh, thank you very much. It's Scotland in the winter, so it's very close to home, which I also like doing is shooting very, very close.
But it's so
home.
Cold.
Well,
I'm joking.
It was right beside the car, so it wasn't. It wasn't too bad. It wasn't too bad. Listen, Charlie, I've thoroughly enjoyed having a chat with you. It's been such a pleasure. But no, thank you so much for your time. It's been a real honor, and please carry on. Please carry on doing what you're doing, because it's a huge contribution to our art.
Thank you.
You're welcome.